Hi, I'm Curtis Jackson Jacobs. I'm a sociologist. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sociology of interpersonal violence. In particular, I want to talk about physical fights and what goes on during the face-to-face interaction between people who are actually involved in physical fights and people who are present on the scene. I'm using the way I'm able to float above my uh, PowerPoint presentation is that I'm using some software called Stage Presence, which has been developed by NuVixa. You can find their website, vix.tv. Associated with this video is a handout which is 6 pages long. And in a moment, I'm going to get to some video data for which I've included some transcripts and still images. It's important for you to have that either printed out or open in a separate window to look at while going through the videos so that you can understand what's going on and what I'm trying to do with the analysis. So if you haven't already printed out a copy, please take a moment to do so. You can also find depending where you found this video, you can find that handout on my own website, which is curtisjacksonjacobs.com/discuss. You can also find a blank presentation of this PowerPoint and the videos and data associated with it. So a good place to start, I think, is to explain what I mean by the title, social organization in violence. I think most of us are used to thinking about violence as being socially organized at various levels of higher orders of social life, such as demographic groups. What kind of people are involved in violence? What kind of places does violence happen? Even what times of the week? We know that there's more violence over weekends, Saturday nights, when people have been drinking, things like that. Okay. What I'm going to talk about is something that people are less familiar with, is the idea that what happens within violence itself, within face-to-face interactions and body-to-body interactions, there is actually a very high degree of social order. What's going on is not simply instinctive psychological response, the way that animals fight, but socially organized, socially meaningful behavior, a form of social interaction. Not quite like conversation where we take turns and such, but nonetheless a form of interaction in which we are, or the individuals involved, are orienting to one another's movements and reacting and aware of the meaning of their conduct for outside observers and are constantly sensitive to that and constructing their action to be meaningful to audiences and people witnessing it and within their own lives. So I'll present a couple kinds of data. Some of it will be ethnographic, but primarily I want to focus on videotaped evidence of physical fights. Broadly speaking, the kind of research that I'm talking about falls into what a lot of people would call the symbolic interactionist or interactionist tradition within sociology. So some studies that have been, some major landmark studies that have been conducted in this fashion of research on violence have been Jack Katz's 1988 book, Seductions of Crime. I'll talk a little bit more about some of that research in a moment. I'll also mention some details from Randall Collins' more recent 2008 book, Violence: A Micro-Sociological Theory. Now, I've also conducted a couple of research projects on violence, and specifically I focus on physical fights in both of these. I find it useful to contrast physical fights with other forms of violence. As we typically think about violence, we usually consider it an interaction between a perpetrator and a victim. However, people who are involved in violence often consider the violence, or people who are involved in physical fights specifically, view the violence more as a form of recreation, almost as an athletic competition, than they do a form of domination and a means of imposing one's will on another person, that kind of thing. So I'm going to show a couple of pieces of evidence to contrast the two. There's a very negotiated, cooperative, competitive character to physical fights that is absent from one-sided unilateral attacks. So first piece of research I did on violence was from 99 to 2004, I received some funding from the UCLA Graduate Division and the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. I got a sample of about 85 individuals who were involved in physical fights from time to time. Mostly these were suburban, affluent, white young men and women who would get into physical fights, oftentimes at bars and house parties while out drinking. When they'd been in high school, they would get in fights after school frequently, that kind of thing. And I collected about 189 cases of violent encounters, 51 cases of near fights, which I found important to use to sort of illustrate the differences between interactions that ended with a verbal conflict and those that culminated in violence. Now, even with this large data set, and with all the previous research that's been done on violence, other researchers have gathered thousands of cases. I found that there were a lot of questions I couldn't answer, and I'll turn to those in a minute. There were some specific advantages to this kind of data, interviews and my own direct observations of physical fights, but there were also limitations, okay? I couldn't answer, for example, the question, why do people sometimes verbally agree to fight, meet at a place to fight, for example, after school at 3 o'clock with a crowd watching, then stand there for 5 or 10 minutes waiting for someone to throw the first punch. Then suddenly somebody does throw the first punch, and there's a radical transformation in the situation in which both people start throwing punches very rapidly and beating each other. And then suddenly they'll stop fighting, and it appears almost that they spontaneously quit fighting, and the fight ends somehow. And sometimes it's very difficult to understand how that happens. And certainly the ethnographic data were, I found, insufficient to fully explain how that happens. So I began to collect cases of video recorded violent events. These have become very easily available on the internet. You can find as many as you want on YouTube. I've narrowed my own data set to about 50 recordings. That's about as many as I can manage to transcribe, at least in some detail, and do some level of analysis on, although it's possible to gather any number of cases. Most of these are involving people who have a cell phone camera out videotaping something that's happened. Sometimes it's a security camera, occasionally a dashboard camera on a police car, that kind of thing. So let me try to move into the data, and as I get there, that's when I'll start to make some of the methodological points about the specific limitations and advantages of each of these kinds of data. All right, so I'd like to start getting into the data right now and illustrate some of what I mean. On the second page of the handout, at the top, you see a case here labeled righteous slaughter. This is a term from Jack Katz's book, Seductions of Crime. This is sort of the archetypal form of violence that we think of, an enraged, violent attack by one person against another, frequently ending in homicide, although not always, an impassioned attack. And in every case that he studied, that he could find, that took this form of righteous slaughter, the interaction followed, involved a series of stages. There was always a moment of insult and humiliation in which the attacker felt sort of cornered into a last stand by the victim. Okay, the victim to be, felt that they had to make a stand in defense of themselves, and then came to feel enraged that the victim had committed a wrong and evil act, and that they needed to be punished for this. And finally, in the last stage, or the attacker attacks in a spirit of righteous indignation, sort of a sacrificial sentiment, trying to demonstrate the evilness of the victim's actions by attacking them bodily. I'll read a short example. This was in Katz's book. It's actually drawn from Lundsgaard's book from 1977 called Murder in Space City. This is a standard case. It begins similarly to some physical fights, but what you see is not competition, but an attack that ends in a murder. So while in a cafe late one Saturday evening, the victim, who had a reputation as a tough, began picking barbecued food from the killer's plate. The killer complained, but the victim persisted, defiantly splashing hot sauce on the killer, an insult and a humiliation. So when the fight escalated, the killer pulled out his knife and killed the victim. All right. So what you see is a humiliation followed by an attack to correct the injustice of that's been committed, this violation. So we learn some things from the ethnographic materials, but we don't get a sense of what goes on with people's actual bodies. What do these things actually look like? We don't see that in full detail from the ethnographic data. Let me show one of my videos. This is case 42 in my data set. I use the boxing announcers convention of describing people by the color of their clothing. This guy, right here, the victim who's a cell phone talker, I call him Gray Shirt. And this guy next to him, is in a blue jersey with white sleeves. I call him Blue Jersey. This is the attacker. And I use this case to illustrate, a substantive point, just to illustrate the difference between how different in the extremes one-sided violence looks from a competitive, mutual fight. I make a substantive point there. I'll also talk about some methodological points, what the video provides us. But you'll see that Gray Shirt, for example, tries to get away from Blue Jersey, tries to exit the building. Blue Jersey pulls him back in and continues beating him, beats him past the point of unconsciousness, appears to, continue kicking him, and appears to sort of rifle through his belongings, maybe steals his or takes his cell phone. And here I will mention one of the methodological limitations. We do not know what occurred before this violent act. We don't know necessarily all the motivations and reasons why this particular individual was attacked. Although if we went into finer detail, we could maybe suggest why there was a transition at this particular moment to violence. But anyway, so let me stop talking. I will play the video.
You see him turn around and go down?
Okay, so what we saw there was a dramatic example of what one-sided violence looks like. That although there is an interaction, an exchange, a transaction leading up to this violence, you do see the cell phone talker, Gray Shirt, get angry and sort of slam his hand down, and that may be an illustration of what we might call victim precipitation in the criminological literature. That may be why, and the fact that he was talking on a phone may be why he was targeted for an attack. Victim precipitation isn't a term meant to blame the victim, but to explain what their role is in this. But in any case, primarily what I wanted to illustrate is that this is the nature of one-sided violence. And Now I want to compare that to mutual bilateral competitive violence. I want to focus on the negotiated character of physical fights. Let me actually mention a couple of last limitations of this kind of data. As I mentioned before, we don't know what happens before the case. We can't really hear all the dialogue here. So we don't know the motivations. We don't know if these people have prior relationships. We don't know if they have relationships later or what happened in this case. Also, video cameras are at a fixed position unless someone is walking around with a cell phone camera following. Or in another case I'll show with a documentary camera. So there are limitations, and there are in some ways advantages to using ethnographic data. So one of those is to illustrate sort of the negotiated character of the conflicts that lead up to physical fights. I'm going to present a case from my own ethnographic research. This is also on the second page of your handout. This was case number 68 from Net Research, Aaron versus the Cowboy. As I mentioned before, physical fighters often view violence through a sort of athletic metaphor. From the perspective of people involved in physical fights, there's not a victim and an attacker, but instead opponents. There are winners and losers, or a fight can end in a draw, but there are competitors, is how people involved in physical fights see it. And there's a high degree of negotiation about how a fight's going to take place, why and where, sometimes with what weapons, these kinds of things. And we'll see that in this case, okay? So let me just go ahead and read it. Aaron, well, actually, a little bit more background. Aaron is he's talking about a fight that occurred when he was in high school. He's a guy who styled himself as a punk rocker type. He and his friend Brett, and they had a running conflict with these guys who were, quote, cowboys, as he describes them. So as Aaron explains, I see two of the cowboys in their car. They're off campus during lunch, and this big Mexican guy flipping us off and stuff. So me and Brett followed them into this Taco Bell, sat next to them, and we're just staring at them. This huge Mexican looks at me and goes, "What are you fucking looking at? You got a problem?" And I go, "Yeah, I got a problem." So they're actually agreeing here to fight. And he says, "Well, why don't we go behind Safeway?" Even negotiating where to go and fight. So in fact, they drove around to the back. And as Aaron showed me, he still had the ring, this kind of spiked ring that he wore, and I guess his opponent didn't want to be punched with that. So his opponent was like, "You better take those off," and Aaron was like, "No, fuck you," and the guy reportedly grabs a bottle and smashes it. Aaron agrees to take the spikes off, so he takes his ring off, and this guy puts down the bottle. The other guy throws the first punch while Brett's sitting there like my trainer. The guys on the other side are watching. He's like my trainer, like Mick from Rocky. "Come on, Aaron." So I got a couple good like karate kicks in, but he probably landed more, and his punches were probably a lot harder than mine. And I asked him who broke it up, Brett and this guy's friends. Alright, so a great degree of negotiation, not only about whether we're going to fight, but the details of how we're going to fight and where. Now, in the next case, a video case I want to show, this is actually excerpted from a documentary called Camp Katrina about the aftermath of the hurricane in New Orleans, and the individuals here, red shirt and white shirt, are living at a sort of an encampment that's people are living in tents behind a house after the city's been destroyed, and they work in the daytime doing construction. But on this night, they're getting drunk. Red shirt, white shirt, and red shirt's female companion, black shirt. They're all getting drunk together. They start arguing about who owes who money. So this short minute and a half segment, they negotiate and agree. White shirt and green shirt, or white shirt and red shirt propose to fight. They agree. They go to the location of the fight, and then they negotiate not to fight. So it's actually a very similar case to Aaron versus the Cowboy, yet it doesn't end in violence. Let me just point out, this is another case. This is another video where the audio is not great quality, and especially the video happens to be fairly poor quality. What I've done here is transcribe some of the conversation and transpose that onto the video itself in the form of subtitles. So you can read along with what the people are actually saying, since it's difficult to hear what they're saying to each other.
I'm a badass motherfucker. You want to take it around the block, man? Let's go. Right now. Let's go. Let's go. You got your money on it? No, I got the money. All right. Well, after we get ass, we'll come back and get the money from you. Get the fuck out of here. You ain't coming over here filming this shit. You hear me? No, you ain't filming this, dude. This is off limits. Shut your cameras on. This ain't about it. Go. What? Don't be grabbing up for no weapons. No weapons, man. I ain't got no weapons. I got no weapon to fucking hit you with. No. Don't be grabbing no weapons to try and hit me with. That's all you grab. What's up, my nice side? I ain't fighting with you. Now, get your hand. I'm getting hurt. Whatever I need to do, I'm going to do. I'm not getting hurt.
So what did we get out of watching a video that was very similar to the previous ethnographic case? The advantage here, I would say, is that we can see is verifiability. All right, since the violence doesn't actually come off, we don't get to learn about what happens during violence through this video, but this illustrates the first methodological point: verifiability. All right, it's more credible in a sense than the interview account that Aaron gave me. Now, let me move on to cases where the violence actually occurs, disputes that turn into full-blown violence. In some cases, we can witness the disputes happening. In others, the videos begin right before the violence occurs. And in those cases, we just sort of have to take the data as it is, since it's hard to go out looking for violence with a camera and videotape it yourself. And if you do that, as it happens, a lot of times when people get into physical fights, what they're trying to do is perform. They're trying to make a performance. So the camera will actually encourage violence. So as a methodological strategy, that's probably not ethical to go out to places where violence is likely with a camera, because you're likely to create the phenomenon which you're videotaping. So we have to sort of rely on other people to videotape things, and that's why a large data set's useful. Some of these cases we don't see the arguments happening. However, I found it useful to look at 4 moments in violence, okay, in violent interactions, the videotapes of what happens during violence. The first place that I find it useful to look, and these are things that we cannot access very well from interview and ethnographic data. The opening moves in violent interaction, engagements. How do people actually engage with another person? How do they start the violence? How do they get from talking, from standing in front of each other, to throwing punches at each other? The second moment, the continuous stretches of violence that happen after the engagement starts. I call these entanglements, since people frequently end up being within arm's reach of one another, at least for a stretch of time, and are more or less entangled in violence. The violent interaction, it's radically different than ordinary face-to-face conversation and the interaction that precedes and the interaction that follows violence. It's not ordinary, it's extraordinary interaction in which people's bodies become quite entangled with one another. And as you'll see, this creates very serious practical problems for how to disengage. How do you stop an entanglement? Okay. And that's the fourth moment. But the third moment that's useful to look at is moments when third parties join or interrupt the violent entanglement. We'll see some of those. I won't analyze too many of these. I actually am going to focus primarily on moment 1 and moment 4. Moment 4 are the closings of violence, disengagements. And what we find is that there is a remarkable degree of collaboration, cooperation going on during these moments. And often they're fractions of seconds. So it takes repeated viewing. So I'll play some of these videos over and over again. My strategy is to watch the video in full length, transcribe it. It usually takes anywhere from 1 to 4 hours to transcribe about 1 minute of bodily interaction at the level of detail that I provide here on the handout, which hopefully you have. So you have to be a little bit strategic when doing this kind of analysis and what you actually want to transcribe. It takes quite a long time. But it's important to do it at a very fine level of detail. As you'll see, sometimes the engagement, the opening moves, which involve a sequence of collaboration. One person has to make a opening gesture, such as the take your best shot posture, which is familiar to most people. You know, opening the arms and pressing your chest and face forward, making yourself vulnerable to the other person, and the other person may then throw a punch or try to grab someone around the waist, that kind of thing. Those exchanges often happen at the level of fractions of seconds, and strategically, one of the ways to understand those, to see what's going on, is to just look at those 1.5 seconds or half-second stretches over and over again. So I'll probably show these a couple times, and with the still images in front of you, it'll be easier to catch what's going on here, the fine detail. And much of our interaction of all types, even ordinary conversation, happens at this very fine micro level that we're not consciously aware of, yet we are very socially sensitive to minute changes in situations and what's going on. So the first case I want to show is case 26, white belt versus loose shirt. This here is the woman who I call white belt. This was downloaded from a commercial website. Loose shirt over here. The women are dressed very similarly, so I can refer to them. The only real difference in their clothing is one of them has a white belt on, the other one we can't see her belt. Interestingly, both have their hair in ponytails, suggesting they may have already tied their hair up in anticipation of a fight. You can't see much of the audience, but we can hear them. This is probably an after-school fight. This is a case where we don't see much of the build-up to the fight, but we can see, this is where video is useful, how the opening moves work. How do people actually start throwing first punches? And I want you to notice one thing that's interesting. If you look, the image here of these two women fighting is very close to how orthodox boxers fight. That's a image there of two boxers fighting in the Chicago Golden Gloves. One of them, red shirt, happens to be myself. Back when I was in fighting condition, I certainly wouldn't be able to do this at the present. But notice how similar the postures are between myself and my opponent, white shirt, to how white belt and loose shirt are positioned in the opening moves. Alright, so I'll show the full video first.
Oh, your phone out. Oh, 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 fuck. Damn, they get down, dude.